When it comes to the history of inflation, Zimbabwe and Hungary take the lead. Hungary holds the record for the highest denomination banknote ever printed, the 100 quintillion pengo note. That's 100 followed by 18 zeros, printed in 1946. In Zimbabwe, the Reserve Bank printed the $100 trillion note in 2008. That's 100 followed by 12 zeros, a symbol of an economy in free fall. Fast forward to 2025, Zimbabwe has a new currency. It's known as the ZiG, short for Zimbabwe Gold. Introduced in April 2024, the ZiG represents the latest chapter in a long, chaotic saga of currency experiments. And these currency experiments, some of them were official and some were improvised. But they were all born out of crisis. From Gideon Gono's bearer checks to John Mangudla's bond notes. From long and winding queues to burning money at ATMs. From slashing zeros during the Gono era to printing bond notes that burned worse than gonorrhea. From the original Zim dollar and all its variants to the RTGS dollar, and now the ZiG. This is a comprehensive history of Zimbabwe's economic collapse, with a special focus on ESAP, the DRC war, and the land reform program. Fellow Sadzaitas, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, vasinamalites, varikudya rice, never sinama rights. Welcome to the special report. The Zimbabwean dollar was introduced on the 18th of April 1980, replacing the Rhodesian dollar at the same value. In the early years, the Zim dollar was actually worth more than the US dollar, and Zimbabwe was an industrial giant by African standards, attracting migrant workers from across the region. So what went wrong between 1980 and 2008, and even beyond? How did Zimbabwe move from having one of the strongest currencies in Africa to printing the $100 trillion note, which was worth less than a loaf of bread? Well, let's begin in the early 80s. You see, at independence, the government of Zimbabwe did what young nations do. It spent a lot of money trying to correct colonial imbalances in order to fulfill the promise of independence. And here is what the government paid for: a free primary education, a cheap secondary education, affordable healthcare. It provided support for farmers. It put in place price controls to make things affordable. It even hired thousands of new civil servants, skyrocketing the wage bill. And on top of that, there was a huge military spending. Zimbabwe was coming out of a 14-year-long liberation war. The new government had to build a new army from Zipra, Zanla, and the old Rhodesian forces. And then came the Renamo problem in Mozambique, where Zimbabwe deployed its military, pushing defense spending even higher. All of this cost a lot of money. So by the late 1980s, most of the national budget was going to salaries and subsidies. For those who might not know, a subsidy is a targeted financial help by the government to make things cheaper or free for selected groups. An example of this is BIM, a government program which was introduced around 2001 to cover school fees for the needy. So in the early 80s, the government had many such programs, and that increased expenditure. Furthermore, Zimbabwe had inherited an aging manufacturing industry which had survived under sanctions since 1965 when Ian Smith signed UDI. So by the mid-80s, local factories had old machines and the cost of production was just too high. They just couldn't compete. This caused a big problem. Export earnings fell, and foreign currency became very scarce. So without forex, Zimbabwe could not import fuel, spare parts, or raw materials. So the country now had a double crisis. Number one, the government was spending too much money. And number two, exports were bringing in less money. Expenditure was higher than income. By 1990, Zimbabwe was in crisis and still had a huge government workforce. Industries were weak and protected from competition. So Zimbabwe needed money as soon as possible. The only places Zimbabwe could borrow large amounts were the IMF, the World Bank, and Western superpowers in general. All of them wanted Zimbabwe to make big economic changes. Their message was simple. If you want money, you must change your entire economic system under an economic structural adjustment program, commonly known as ESAP. So tiri kuti isusu zvinhu pazvakatanga kuoma, Zimbabwe yakakumbira chikwereti. Zvikanzi neIMF neWorld Bank, mari tinayo tinokupai, but we don't like the way you run your government. You're gonna have to make a lot of changes, and mari iyoyo kana takupai munongoishandisa chete under a program inonzi ESAP, and program iyoyo ine ma-conditions ayo. So Zimbabwe agreed and implemented ESAP from 1991 to 1995. But what really was ESAP and what was it trying to do? Well, the idea behind ESAP was simple, well, at least in principle. Open the economy, cut government spending, and let private companies lead the economy. In simple terms, it was like saying, Zimbabwe, you must now stand on your own. The government must stop supporting everything. ESAP demanded 5 big changes. Number one, they said, your government is too big. Cut government spending and retrench government employees to lower your wage bill. Number two, they said, stop overprotecting your local industries by having laws that discourage imports. Open borders to imports. Number three, they said, remove price controls. Set the market free. Number four, they said, reduce the value of your local currency against the US dollar to make it cheaper to invest in Zimbabwe. Number five, they said, privatize some of your state-owned companies, your parastatals. And so, ESAP was rolled out in 1991 with its sweeping reforms across the economy. But just as Zimbabwe was trying to find its feet under ESAP, a brutal drought hit in 1992. It drove inflation even higher and devastated agriculture, which forms the core of Zimbabwe's economy. By 1994, the promised economic boom under ESAP had turned into a distant dream. Instead of economic growth, the nation faced widespread unemployment. Industries were either declining or shutting down. Inflation skyrocketed and the government reduced its funding for schools, hospitals, and other things that people relied on. The standards, which Zimbabwe had been known for since independence, started going down amid rising poverty. What was supposed to be a pathway to prosperity became a sudden drop into hardship. But what went wrong? Well, ESAP wasn't bad on paper. It made sense in principle. I mean, encouraging trade and allowing markets to function freely, nothing wrong with that. What actually went wrong was timing and implementation. The reforms were introduced too quickly. They were hurried without proper preparation. Remember, I said that the government's wage bill was too big. So ESAP encouraged the government to retrench its workers in the hope that those workers would find jobs in the private sector or start their own small businesses. But what actually happened is that the government reduced its workforce before the private sector was equipped to create new jobs. It opened markets to international competition before local businesses could prepare. And it eliminated subsidies too soon before people's incomes could cover the increased cost of living. Zimbabwe was suddenly thrown into the cold waters of global competition without a life jacket. And as the economy weakened, public discontent increased. This was followed by massive strikes by civil servants in 1996 as workers demanded for better pay. It never rained but poured for the Zimbabwean government, because in 1997, the war veterans joined in on the demonstrations. They were tired of unkept promises and finally decided that enough was enough. They launched a wave of protests against President Robert Mugabe, including a march to State House. They were demanding the compensation packages that they had been promised years earlier as a token of appreciation for their participation in the liberation struggle. And they meant business, hitting Robert Mugabe with a level of defiance he had never witnessed from his fellow comrades since independence. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the power of war veterans. The irony, though, is that they eventually participated in the removal of Robert Mugabe during the 2017 coup. Now, I hope you can see why Blessed Geza initially gave ED headaches, and why ED quickly started giving war vets goodies as soon as Blessed Geza started causing problems. Mnangagwa knows firsthand the influence of war vets, because in one incident during the 1997 war vets crisis, President Mugabe was away on a foreign trip. So the war veterans turned their fire on Justice Minister Emmerson Mnangagwa. He stepped outside to address them, only to be shouted down and forced to retreat without a word. This only added petrol to the fire, because the war vets continued piling on the pressure, including shouting down President Mugabe during his Heroes Day speech in August of 1997. President Robert Mugabe was cornered. His regime now had an existential crisis, whose authors were the very people who traditionally ensured and guaranteed his government's existence. And so, he buckled under pressure. War veterans were given $50,000 each. An estimated 50,000 people benefited from this program. The total cost came to 4.2 billion Zimbabwean dollars. And in US dollars, over 300 million. That money is today worth more than 600 million US dollars when adjusted by inflation. It was 3% of Zimbabwe's total economic output in 1997. And here is what's worse. All that money was not budgeted for. It doesn't take an economist to explain the implications. Afterwards, the Zimbabwean government began making plans to redistribute land to landless blacks. It announced its intention to list more than 1,400 farms for redistribution. Many of these farms were productive. When this happened, the IMF and other donors threatened to pull out of Zimbabwe. And then suddenly, rumors started spreading around that the country's foreign reserves were almost finished. And for the benefit of those who might not know, foreign reserves are like a country's savings account meant to be used during national crisis. So when people started hearing that the country was running out of its savings, They started stocking up on US dollars in panic, and the Zim dollar started losing value quickly. Desperate to save the situation, the government injected 15 million US dollars to prop up the Zim dollar. But it was a hopeless attempt. And soon after, Zimbabwe was hit by one of the darkest days in its economic history. It was the 14th of November, 1997, late on a Friday, when the inevitable happened. The Zimbabwean dollar crashed by 72%. That means it lost its purchasing power by 72% for anything priced in US dollars. The stock market also collapsed by 46%. It simply means $1 million investment was now worth $540,000. That's a loss of $460,000. Nearly half of your investment gone. Just like that. But as if the whole thing was scripted in Hollywood, a national power cut happened on that very same day. Talk about a triple disaster. Ameno kuti yaiva triple alliance yerekana kuti a triple entente. First it was political darkness, and then economic darkness, and now literal darkness. ZESA did not want to be left out. People began calling it Black Friday. What a befitting name indeed. After this, the government ordered companies to shut down their foreign currency accounts, hoping that the US dollars held in those accounts would flow back into the market and stop the Zim dollar from falling. But the plan backfired. Confidence collapsed even further. The stock market kept falling, the Zim dollar kept sinking, and investors began pulling out of Zimbabwe. By 1998, prices of basic goods had risen by almost 50%. Public protests grew louder, and for the first time since Gukurahundi, the army was deployed against civilians in a bid to quell unrest. The government then brought back price controls, the same controls that ESAP had removed. But it became clear that hurumende yakanga yakusona magadziko ichida kuti manyoka asapoye. Yes, the economy had diarrhea. What the government was doing with price controls was equivalent to stitching up one's buttocks in the hope of stopping diarrhea poo from coming out. You fix one thing, but create an even bigger problem. If you want to solve an issue permanently, you deal with the root cause, not the symptoms. And most importantly, you learn from your mistakes. You don't repeat them. Because repeating them either means you are incompetent or you just don't care. Which brings us to the next disaster, the DRC war. Just when you would think that the Zimbabwean government had learned its lesson about overspending, it decided to enter the DRC war in August of 1998. A disastrous choice. Stronger economies like South Africa stayed out of that conflict. Yet, a struggling and declining economy like Zimbabwe decided to join, leading a divided SADC war effort. Some estimates say that Zimbabwe was spending at least $1 million a day on that war, draining the economy even further and weakening the currency even more. By the time we got to the year 2000, Zimbabwe's economy was already in deep recession. Unemployment was at record levels. Foreign currency had virtually dried up. Investor confidence was at its lowest, and the country's credit rating had collapsed. to make matters worse, the social base that once supported ZANU-PF was now crumbling. The labor movement, which had been organizing throughout the 90s, had now transformed into a powerful political force, the MDC. So now, it's in this environment, this context, a collapsing economy, rising anger within the masses, a new vibrant opposition party, and pressure from the war vets, that land reform moved from policy discussion to political expediency. Let's get one thing very clear. Land reform was very necessary. It was justified and historically overdue. A few thousand white commercial farmers controlled most of the country's best agricultural land, while millions of black families were crowded in poor, dry regions. Correcting that imbalance was not only noble, it was inevitable. But the way it was eventually carried out was shaped by politics, not planning. The program was hurried, chaotic, and often violent. Not because land redistribution was inherently chaotic, but because the government was racing against a rising opposition, a restless population, and pressure from war veterans who had already flexed their political power in 1997. So what began as a legitimate national cause became intertwined with political survival. The land reform was a noble objective, but mixed with opportunistic timing. Necessary? Yes, but executed at the worst possible moment and under the worst possible economic conditions and in the most confrontational manner. The consequences? Well, economic isolation, sanctions, capital flight, and agricultural collapse. Agricultural collapse for an agrarian economy is like a literal heart attack. You don't play politics with the very thing that sustains your economy. And that, fellow Sadaitas, is how the seeds of Zimbabwe's economic collapse were planted. And the impact is still felt to this day. The overspending of the 1980s, the rushed ESAP reforms, the collapse of exports, the war veterans payouts, Black Friday, the DRC war, corruption, which has evolved into modern day tenderpreneurship, wanton looting without repercussions, cadre deployment, incompetence. None of these things are random. They are all connected. They are the dominoes that lined up perfectly, resulting in the economic collapse we witnessed in 2008. And when you zoom out, one thing becomes crystal clear: that the quality of decisions made from 1990 to 1999 reflected the quality of leadership itself. A leadership that reacted instead of planning. A leadership that spent recklessly, reformed carelessly, and governed defensively. A leadership that kept digging even after the hole was already deep. So, is it a surprise that the economy continued to tumble? Is it shocking that by the mid-2000s, inflation was exploding, salaries meant nothing, and supermarket shelves were literally empty? Is it surprising that by 2008, Zimbabwe printed the infamous $100 trillion note, the global symbol of economic collapse? This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mystery. It wasn't bad luck either. It was the unavoidable outcome of a decade defined by poor choices, ignored warnings, and a leadership that simply refused to adapt. And for the avoidance of doubt, sanctions were not the genesis of our problems. We were already on an economic suicidal path. long before the sanctions arrived. When they eventually came, they simply accelerated a collapse that had already begun. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.